What's up, everybody? Welcome to Adobe Live. My name is Flynn, and I am joined by Jeremy Lord. How are you, Jeremy?
Good, thanks, Flynn. How are you going?
Yep, really, really good. We got a bit of a sleep in today, so rather than our 8:30 a.m. start for this series, we got to rest all the way, until 9 a.m., which is really nice for us.
A whole half hour.
It's amazing what half an hour in the morning can do, though, right?
It really does, actually. Yeah.
Hey, everybody in chat. Hey, Steve. Hey, Dee. Good to see you. Hey, Johanna. Thanks for joining us today. So we are halfway through our Getting Started with Illustration series.
Yeah.
Here we are.
Yeah, that's right. So episode 3 of 4.
3 or 4. That's right. Yep. So last week will be our last in this series. If you're watching this on YouTube or you missed any of the previous ones, you can jump back and watch the other episodes. We literally starting from scratch. So design this in a way that if you don't have a lot of experience in illustration, you can start there. If maybe you're a little bit more experienced, you can kind of skip through. And there's lots of tips and tricks and things, and there's tons of interesting stuff that we're going to be talking about today. Do you want to give us a bit of a short overview, Jeremy, of what you have in store
Yeah.
for us?
So today we're going to actually kind of look at where sort of past episodes have been a little bit more focused on like actually doing illustration directly into Photoshop, as in like drawing and building the artwork straight into Photoshop. Today we're going to kind of go a little bit back to the source, if you will, back to the kind of the architect of Photoshop, which is image compositing.
Yeah.
And we're going to use different assets. So we've got this kind of like pencil drawing of a wolf. We've got some watercolor assets. We're going to use all these different images and compile them together to create something that's going to look analog, but will be created almost entirely in Photoshop, except for the actual assets themselves. And then we'll talk a little bit about files and like saving files and prepping files and all that kind of stuff, which is like the tail end. Once the illustration is done, how do you actually output this? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then time allowing, we might sort of touch upon artboards, but that's a little bit of an extra kind of thing at the end, so we might not get there. So that's today's kind of look at Photoshop, is kind of a little bit more of an analog switch to it than purely just everything in Photoshop.
Yeah, cool. I like it. Going back to our roots. Hey, Miguel and Jack, great to see you in chat. It's good to have you here. Just before we get started with today's stream, I'm just going to bring up our schedule for Adobe Live here in Sydney. A couple of changes since yesterday. So yesterday was our other series, which is with Ian Haig, so Premiere Pro. Here we are, Wednesday, 9 a.m. here in Sydney, which is Getting Started with Illustration, Jeremy Lord. Tomorrow we have a new face to Adobe Live, Greta Larkins, and we're going to be doing these amazing animated GIFs. She's Fash GIF. Maybe Johanna can find a link for that, Fash GIF, and throw it in chat. She does some really great stuff, and that's with Jackie Winter group. So we're going to be bringing a new series of some fresh new faces to Adobe Live, which is very exciting. And Greta's the first one off the rank. And then we have Joy Lee joining us again for the second part of her branding and design. And then Bill Hope doing impossible isometric animation on Friday. So we have like a bit of a double whammy happening on Friday. So we got a jam-packed week, lots of stuff to come, and I hope you can join us. But Jeremy Lord, episode 3 of this series.
Let's go. Full week.
Let's get cracking. I'm going to put some music on. You guys tell me if it's too loud or too soft. And yeah, just if this is your first time to these streams, you'll notice that there is a timer for Q&A down the bottom, and so we take a little bit of a break at about halfway, where we can answer lots of questions. But please just ask questions as you're going, and we'll answer them if we can while we're going, or we'll answer them in our little break.
Yeah. So let's get stuck in. Before we do, I think I'd just like a tiny little recap of the things that we've spoken about in the last 2 sessions, which have been super basics in Photoshop. Session 1, we spoke about sort of creating brushes and sketching in Photoshop and using blending mode. So it was all about sort of pure raw drawing in Photoshop. Session 2 was a little bit more about selection tools and layers and adjustments, working destructively, non-destructively, and looking at color. And so today is going to be still kind of illustration, but a little bit more based on dragging and dropping different components of different images and mixing it all together to create some artwork, and then hopefully we'll have time to get to saving that artwork at the end of it as well. And so as always, this is always really cool for me. I really enjoy doing all these live streams because it's like I get to do some illustration and kind of talk to other people while I'm doing it. Usually it's just me on my lonesome. So hope ask me a bunch of questions and we can kind of riff and talk about stuff. I love going on tangents as well. So pop a bunch of questions in and we'll get started. So as I said, I've got all these different assets. They're just little kind of ink splatters and random washes and things that I've created analog. So all of this stuff is just pencil and paper. This drawing here and where was it? This one? Nope. Here, I should probably name these something more clear than scan 19 and 20. But yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at sort of bringing all these different elements together into the same image. So first thing we're going to do is create a new document. Always in Photoshop, because Photoshop is not vector, it's pixels. You need to consider what size you're going to be doing this when you're at this stage. So as soon as you walk through the gates, you need to be aware of what the end of the road is going to look like. If you're doing it for a client who's going to print this on a poster, you need to know the size of the poster. If you're doing it on a packaging item, you need to know the dimensions of these things, because you always need to work to size in Photoshop, which is not necessarily something that you need to worry too much about when you're working in Illustrator. We'll go with A3 today, simply because it's actually, we'll go with A4 because we're not working super big. And this is just for a little bit of a demo. So if you're
not 100% sure of what the output is going to be, what would be your default? You just A3 is probably okay, or
I usually work at A2.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is pretty sizable. Mm-hmm. So A2 is double A3. If you're in doubt, always just work a little bit bigger. You'll sacrifice file size, and you may sacrifice maybe speed, depending on what model your computer is and how old it is. It might start to kind of drag its feet a little bit. But it's always just kind of a little bit safer. Whenever I do a personal illustration, I think about these things and just in case I actually make something really cool, if I've made it at A2 or A4, sorry, I might be a little bit sad at the end of it because I want to print it on bigger things or whatever, and that's always a little bit of a problem. So it's always good just to kind of be extra safe, but yeah, you do need to be aware of file size as well, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later on as well. So I've made my new empty background, just standard, no layers, no nothing, just white background. And I'm just going to start importing different things in. So we'll start with the base, which is going to be this watercolor. So again, all of this is done in analog. And we've got our setup here. As you can see, we've got our tabs up here. So up at the top, we've got all the different images that I've opened up in Photoshop. So that's literally just grabbing a bunch of JPEGs and opening them up in Photoshop. And then I got my file up here. One of the things that we're going to be doing at some stage as well pretty soon is we're going to be cycling through views. So we'll talk about that in a tick. But right now, all I want to do is grab this. So we're going to use our selection tool. You can use any selection tool you want for this, depending on what you're trying to do. Because I've made these relatively separate from each other, there's no overlap. So I'm not going to have a very hard time selecting stuff here and kind of making it all work for me. That might be a little bit tricky later on, but definitely any of these selection tools will do here. Probably actually not the magnetic lasso tool, because watercolor is so varied in its kind of tones. Magnetic lasso tool might have a little bit of a fit trying to figure out exactly what you're trying to do. But yeah, polygon or lasso tool, whatever you're comfortable with here, will work out fine. So we've got our selection active. And Now I'm going to go to the Move tool, which is V on your keyboard, which is just the very, very top of your window here, just this guy.
So remember it by
And
V for very top.
V for very top, or move, yeah, mostly because M is already taken by the tool directly beneath it, which is the marquee tool. Yeah.
And
so we got that.
do you use a tablet to illustrate? Sorry, it's just a question from chat.
I do use a tablet to illustrate, yeah. Right now I'm using a mouse because I'm not really doing very sort of fine, distinctive work, but I do have a tablet with a pen, and I will be using that in a little while. But for now, just mouse is all good.
Great.
So I'm going to take this and move it into my untitled document. So I'm literally just going to click on my selection, drag it, it's going to start moving. And then I'm going to drag that up to the tab of my untitled, wait for that image to come up, and then drag my cursor on top of my image, and it's going to pop it into my image. And you can see it's already created a layer for it. I can select that as much as I want. I'm going to name it as well. Get it always kind of, we talk about this quite a bit. There we go.
Naming layers.
Naming layers, yeah. So it's always a good one. You'll see later on when I go to the final file, it can start to be a little bit tricky. So there is obviously naming layers is always really important. But you'll see a little bit later on that there comes a point where you've got so many layers and they're all quite similar. Naming them just becomes useless anyways, because they're all just names like, blob slightly left of top ear, and then blob slightly lower than first blob.
Right.
And it's like, what do you name them? So it becomes a little bit of a trivial exercise to name these things eventually. But again, in practice, it's always a good idea to do that. So with this one, I could make a selection around this. But I'm actually just going to grab the whole image with this. I'm not even going to make a selection. So again, remember in Photoshop, no selection means everything is selected. If you haven't specified which things you want to do stuff to, by default, it's just going to do it to everything. So we're going to take this, drag it up to our image, and drop it in as well. And we'll just call this pencil. So we can just keep doing this as we go, but for now, let's just stay with this image and start blending these two together. So I've got this guy and that guy standing side by side. You'll notice that they are the same exact size, and that is intentional. So one of the things that we kind of talk about, and it's always super interesting to kind of touch upon this, is obviously Photoshop has come after pencils and watercolors and all these analog mediums. It's a relatively recent in terms of the history of humanity and art. It's what, like 30 years old now?
30 years
Photoshop?
plus, yep, 30 years young.
Yeah. 30 years young, yeah.
It might be, yeah.
And so the way that the program has been built is to try and emulate analog as much as possible and give you like a pencil brush or a watercolor brush or all these different ideas that you can work with that kind of emulate the analog workflow. But what you want to do when you're doing something like this is you want to kind of think about doing your drawings with Photoshop in mind, knowing that you're going to scan these in later on and knowing that you're going to want to play with them a little bit later on. It's a good idea to basically set up real world layers. So this drawing has been done on tracing paper on top of this watercolor drawing. So I have done this watercolor wash first, and then I put a piece of tracing paper on top and put that drawing, and I drew that wolf on it. And if I go to my blending modes, and again, we've been through blending modes in episode 2 or 1, I think, I can't remember, and switch to multiply, you'll see that these guys will align perfectly on top of each other because they have been drawn that way.
Right.
So it's just a good idea to do this, where again, in Photoshop, if you were doing this completely digitally, you would do the outline and then you would slap a layer behind that outline and start putting in some colors. So you obviously can't really do that as easily in analog. So just think about, oh, I'd like to add in some text or something. So draw that separately on a piece of paper away from the other stuff, and then you can scan that and select it separately and bring it in as a separate layer that's going to be editable. So it's basically kind of analog layering, if you will, with Photoshop in mind later on.
Yeah, I quite like
And
that.
it's a really kind of,
It's like we've learnt from Photoshop like how good layers are, so like kind of doing it in
yeah,
the real world.
exactly. And the end result is going to be this analog look. So it will still completely look like you did it all in one piece of paper, with the advantage of all the digital aspects of Photoshop and its layering system. So yeah, it's something to kind of keep in mind when you're doing all this kind of stuff. So we've got already something that will allow us to do a whole range of different things here. So this obviously looks completely analog because it is essentially completely analog. We haven't actually done any illustrating to this image or editing to this image in Photoshop at all. We've just composed two different separate assets together. But the beauty of this is obviously, if I want to change the colors of this wolf, I can do that. So again, my favorite menu in Photoshop, Command U, Hue Sat menu, and that will allow us to kind of play around with the colors, keeping that completely analog look and feel. So something that's like quite enjoyable to play around with is just building it up and kind of editing it, all the while keeping a completely analog look and feel.
Yeah.
So let's bring in a few different assets now.
So when you were
And
talking
we're just
about
gonna,
like scanning stuff in, like, have
yeah.
you ever like just taken a photo on your phone? Like, does it need to be like a really high res scan, or can you kind of fake it a little bit? I'm just thinking about like
Yeah, look,
if we don't have a scanner at home, that's something we could replicate.
yes,
We just need to work on a smaller
you
scale,
could
maybe.
do. You could do. The only problem, scale is one thing. The other thing is mostly this idea of quality of the photo versus a scan. So these images have all been scanned in, and that's why they're uniformly lit all across. There's no, like, often what you'll see when you take a photograph is you'll see something like this happen, where there's going to be like a soft gradient of light because the light is fading off on the edge of the paper, or the lighting in your room is not right, or the angle of the photo isn't quite right. Like,
Yeah,
there's always a little bit more kind of
that
challenge
happens
when
a
you're
lot.
taking a photograph.
That gradient. That's what all
Yeah.
my receipts look like.
Yes, exactly. And so, like, especially if you're going to do something like what I just did here, which is try and get these two guys to line up perfectly. If you're holding your phone at the wrong angle, or you're taking two separate phones, or the lighting changes ever so slightly, you're going to have a much harder time lining those two things up if you've taken photos than if you've got a scanner.
Yeah.
So again, completely possible to do if you have if you don't have a scanner, if you're only taking it on your phone, but it's just going to mean more work for you later on in Photoshop. So again, when you're doing this, the idea here is, like, for instance, this little splat here, it's going to be basically impossible for me to pick these guys off of the page because they're already on watercolor. So really my selection is going to have to stop there. So I'm not going to get these, just not the end of the world, because I've already got a whole bunch. And I can show you guys a little bit later on as well how to add a few more if we really wanted these. But again, this is generally not a great thing to do, because trying to separate this from that later on in Photoshop is going to be a real field day. Which is why you can see that this guy has really, I've actually done purposefully individual patches so that they don't overlap, so that I can select them very easily in Photoshop and then drag them in without having to do too much to them later on.
Cool.
So definitely keep how Photoshop works in mind when you're doing this, because it'll just mean that, like, the more you can set up at this stage when you're doing the analog versions of stuff, the less annoying work you'll have to do later on in Photoshop of, like, trying to clean it up and trying to fix things that you didn't quite get right early on in the process. So yeah, it's just like, again, it's possible. It just means you're going to have to do more work.
Cool. All right. It's good to know. Possible, not recommended.
Yeah. And again, yeah, like scanners aren't necessarily the cheapest thing in the world, but they are invaluable, especially like if you're a digital artist, a scanner is probably not necessarily top of your to buy list. But if you're somebody who likes working analog and who still wants to work with Photoshop, then yeah, scanner is going to be an essential part of your workflow, 100%. All right, so we've brought in a whole bunch of assets. We'll leave these open for now, but one of the things that I like to do is to be able to move my canvas around when I've got like different menus open. If I'm playing around with my brushes, they may be going to get in the way of the canvas. So we're going to cycle through views here. We're going to look at different views that are possible in Photoshop. Excuse me. So this is the standard view. I've got all my different images open here. I can drag from one to the other, but I can't really move my image around as long as it's completely zoomed out. If I zoom in, I can use the spacebar. Spacebar on any tool that you've got selected, doesn't matter what tool you're on. If you hit spacebar, you will access this little hand, which will allow you to move your image around and kind of zoom in on different parts. But you won't be able to do that if the image is fully zoomed out. So what we want to do is we want to cycle through the view, and we're going to do that by hitting F. So F for Francis, and you can see I've got 1, 2, 3 views. So this view is obviously like full screen view. Not super useful because all my menus have gone. I use this sometimes when I'm just doing a sketch and I want all the stuff to just be out of the way, and so I can really kind of focus in on the drawing itself. But if you want to kind of do this, you'll need to be really good with your shortcuts because you can't see any of your layers or anything like that. You don't have any menus available. So you'll have to like know your keyboard shortcuts real well in order to work with that.
That could
so
be
generally,
an interesting challenge. I'd love to do like a stream where we just get someone, hey, you have to do your artwork without seeing anything.
Let's see what happens.
That would be great.
So I generally work in this view, which is still all the windows, but just that artwork. And the cool thing about that view is, like I said, I can move this around. I can do anything that I want to it. I can rotate the canvas. There's a whole range of different things that I can do. Rotate the canvas, by the way, is just R for rotate on your keyboard and access the rotate tool. And then that'll allow you to rotate. You can rotate at increments. So I can't remember the increments. I think it's like 15 degrees each time, and it just goes on and on. So if you want it to be 90 degrees, you just hold down Shift, and it'll do that. If you're rotating to get a better line and you want to snap back, but you're too lazy to, again, shortcut, speeding up your workflow is always really good. Escape will switch back to your standard view.
That's good to know. You can always get home quickly.
Yeah. I use that quite a bit, to be honest.
And why would you rotate your canvas? I've seen you rotate your canvas in the past, like as an
Illustrator. So rotate canvas is essential. Like the same way that you would do, again, this is one of those things that we were talking about before, where Photoshop has been built to emulate the process of working on paper, which is great. When you're doing a drawing, often you'll like turn the page so you can get a better angle on your stroke. So for instance, if I'm trying to do a stroke like this, like that might not be the best angle to get it to do that. So I might rotate my canvas and get a better like movement on my line. Rather than doing this movement, I'm doing a much cleaner movement with my hand. And so rotating a canvas it's crucial when you're doing this, because like when you're doing a drawing, because it'll allow you to get just a better kind of angle on something, or like that's a little bit awkward for me. So I might rotate the canvas and just get a bit of a better angle on that line, just so that I can kind of work a little bit more freely. So when you're doing a drawing, rotating canvas is just going to be part and parcel of doing that. So it's a really good one to know, which is why, again, like speeding it up so that you don't have to go back to the rotate tool and rotate it back. You can just hit escape and not switch tools when I'm drawing is super handy for me to work with. All right, so I've got my drawing. And you can see that there's a few different things happening here, depending on how sort of bright or dark your screen is. You'll see that because I've made a selection, it's taken some of the paper back out of this. So I could erase this, I could kind of edit it. What I might do very quickly is just play with my levels so that that kind of goes away. So levels live up here in your image adjustments, the levels right here. Keyboard shortcut next to that. Always just like, you can basically just forget about menus for most things. Like if you're spending too much time going off your canvas up into, whoops, sorry, Wacom is having a little bit of a fun time.
It's a cool
what's going on here? Yeah, that's interesting. Hello, have we crashed?
That's a new one.
The new one. Yeah,
oh,
sweet.
There
we go. Okay, interesting. Yeah, if you're spending too much time going up to the menus here, it's a bit of wasted time. It's a bit of just kind of messing around. So get used to keyboard shortcuts. And the one for that is Command L, brings this up. And what we'll see is that it'll allow us to kind of just boost the brightness a little bit. And we probably don't need to do it too much because the paper was white. It's just a little bit yellow because all paper is got a little bit of color to it, unless it's been bleached within an inch of its life. So we're just going to boost the whites a little bit. And again, we went through this in the first episode. And that just gets rid of the paper in a nice kind of uniform way. Obviously, if I keep going, I'm going to start losing more and more detail in my image. So there's always a little bit of give and take. But in this image, I'm not having to compromise too much to get that working for me. So I can do that again to this one and get rid of the scan of the document stops here. So I've got paper versus white of the image. I'm going to get rid of that because it's not going to be very uniform for me later on. Now, there's a bunch of different ways I can do that. Either I can be a little bit tricky about it and, again, go into my levels and boost the whites, and that's done it pretty good without losing too much of the drawing. And so now that's kind of relatively clean. You can still see I've got a few different things happening up here. I can get rid of that a little bit later on. And then what I'll do later on is I'll bring in another piece of paper texture to put it back on paper. So it's a little bit weird, just kind of like, why did you get rid of the paper in order to just put one in later on? Mostly because this piece of paper stops here. And so I don't have the full image. Again, that could have been solved by just doing a little bit more planning and having my drawing on a bigger piece of tracing paper or scan it bigger so that it fills out an A4. But the assumption there is that I would have known from the start that I was going to do an A4 here, which I probably should have. But in this case, I just did this as a kind of a messing around kind of thing to see what I could do with Photoshop. And so I wasn't necessarily thinking of putting this in any kind of particular document. So there's again, planning ahead when you're doing this. If you know what you're doing, you're going to be better off later on. But in this instance, it's not necessarily too big a deal for me to just boost the levels a little bit and get that going. Now, there's another thing that I can do. And we're going to talk about the client stamp tool at this stage. And this is something that lives at the heart of Photoshop. So again, Photoshop at its basis is we use that. It's even become a term of this image has been Photoshopped, as in you've gotten rid of a scar on your face, or you've added a third eye, or a second arm, hopefully a third arm rather than a second arm. So that lives at the heart of Photoshop, and one of the tools that allows you to do that is the client stamp tool. So we'll take a look at that right now. And what the client stamp tool does is, assuming that I want to keep this paper texture in the background, but I want to get rid of this pencil mark and a few other little kind of marks that live around on this page. Again, if I am going into my levels and just making it the white of the canvas, I can literally just go in and erase it, and nobody will see the difference because it's just the white of my canvas in Photoshop behind it. So it's just a nice clean white image. That's super easy. But But again, what if I want to keep that? If I just go in and erase, you're going to see all those marks. That's not really great. I wouldn't erase anyways. I'd just do it on a layer mask, which would look the same, but at least it would be non-destructive. So that's not going to work. So I'm going to go to my clone stamp tool, and my clone stamp tool lives right here. It's this little, looks like a little like library stamp, and it's called the clone stamp tool, and the shortcut is S for the stamp tool. So we're going to use this guy. Now this guy works in a little bit of a funny way. If you just grab it and start painting, nothing's going to happen. You're going to get this error message from Photoshop saying, could not use the clone stamp because you haven't defined the source. So the clone stamp tool duplicates certain pixel areas. So first you need to tell it, what do you want me to copy? You haven't defined anything to copy for me, so I don't know what you want me to paint. So we'll do that by selecting a particular source. So let's actually go back to our image just to show you guys with an example of how this works. I've got my clone stamp cursor here, and I'm going to go and press Option. So Option or Alt on your keyboard turns it into this like site's target icon. And what this is asking you to do is go over to an area and select that particular area. So I'm just going to click in here and then let go. And then I'm going to move my cursor over. So you can see now that it's got this like weird pattern inside of it. And that is specifically the target. Those are the pixel groups that I told it to do. If I make my brush bigger, you'll start to see my wolf appear because the brush is so big, it's actually copying almost the entire wolf. So I'm just going to go smaller and I'm going to start painting. And now you can see my cursor. Can you see the little crosshairs on the actual wolf? That's what that is copying. So it's taking the source. If I move that over onto the drawing of the eye, you'll see that I'll paint that eye. So it's literally just copy painting that image over. So that's your clone stamp tool. So it's really handy for copying different things, or for like, you know what, I want to add in an extra little hair here, and I can do that with that. All right, so that's just me adding in one extra little tuft of fur, and you'll see a little preview happen when you do that as you go. And then you can just keep doing that. So there is, if you know what to look for, there is such a thing as clone stamp fails, because this is now super not natural because they're all exactly the same, perfectly identical. This is a dead giveaway of a badly done clone stamping job. And you can see that in certain movies that have a slightly lower SFX budget. You'll see, just like, if you know what to look for, you'll see it straight away now. Usually happens on trees and that kind of stuff. So just be aware when you're doing this that you'll need to kind of grab different sources. So let's go back to our pencil drawing and get rid of these marks. And we're going to do that by, again, using the clone stamp tool. So I want anywhere that's going to be paper. Right, anywhere that's going to be relatively clean paper, I'm going to click here. I might make my brush a little bit bigger. By default, your clone stamp is a soft brush, so soft edge brush, because you don't want it to be too hard, because you want the edge to be a little bit kind of softer and not like a super hard edge, because that's going to be another dead giveaway. It's not going to be as clean. And then we're just going to paint. And you can see here, again, my crosshairs is there. If I move my crosshairs over to one of these little marks, it'll start painting that in as well. So one of the things that you want to do when you're doing this is to continually source different areas of the image, so you get a nice even kind of clone stamp tool. So I've painted like from here, and I'm going to do one kind of little paint, and then I'm going to hold down my Option key, source a different area, paint that in, and then keep doing that, so that we're just grabbing different areas from the image. It's going to make it look a little bit more kind of uniform. And so again, just nice to try and get areas that are going to be a little bit local, and we can start painting. And that's just going to keep the paper texture, all the while getting rid of different things. There's another way that we can do this. If, again, all these tools that have a little triangle, which is basically all of them these days, have a pop-out. So if I click and hold, you'll see different pop-outs. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the one above it, which is the patch tool, this guy. And I'm going to use that to create a bunch of different things. So this one has a whole bunch of tools in it: spot healing, patch tool, all these kind of different things. I'm just going to be interested in the patch tool. They all kind of do similar things, but this one's going to be a little bit easier to do small little bits like this. And how this works is it's going to ask you to draw a selection. So you literally just draw it as if you were using the standard lasso tool. It's just going to do the same exact thing, but with this particular tool. And we're just going to do a patch around this. You want to select a little bit, give it a bit of buffer. And then you can literally just click inside the image and drag. And what it does, if you look, like if I drag my selection above this little black dot, you'll see the black dot appear in my original selection. So it's kind of like filming an area of what you want to do. But so this will then, if I release, it'll do that. And then it'll just kind of smooth off the edge a little bit. So this is really great for just quick, easy little spots and kind of things like this that will allow you just very quickly to get rid of things, and it just smoothens it down for you. So it's a nice kind of, seamless job. So I can try and do it to this.
It's probably a little bit faster than the than clone, because you're going to have to keep referencing a new. There's just a few more clicks involved each time you want to do it, right?
It is a little bit, but again, so here's the thing with all this kind of stuff. It's like, as you can see, if I'm trying to get rid of this whole big thing here and I move that over to like here, it's going to have a little bit of a harder time. It's going to duplicate those two little dots that are living there. So I probably want to move it over to like here, and that works. The catch here is, if you want something done right, do it yourself. And that's a good general rule of thumb for working like this in Photoshop is, the more you let the computer or the program control what you're doing, the higher the risk that it's going to do something that you don't want it to. And it's one of those things that you see in like 3D animation versus classic 2D animation, so like pencil drawing. You see it generally at the end of a Pixar reel or like Lord of the Rings or anything that's super CGI intensive. They'll show you a blooper reel of all the screw-ups that the 3D program has done, where like hair turns pink and stands on edge, or eyeballs kind of stay in place when their head turns and you've got these two floating eyeballs. All these things happen because the computer is rendering it for you. And so it might do things that you haven't told it to do. And so this is definitely very visible in things like this. So we're going to take, let's say we want to like duplicate the ears for whatever reason. So we're going to use the patch tool, and we're going to drag the ears or the eyes down to here, and then let the computer do its thing. So you see what it's done here, where it's kind of blurred these two spots? I have zero control over how it does that. And if I try and do it again from a different point of view, it's going to do a different blur. So again, Photoshop is, through kind of no fault of its own, is just going like, I think you want me to do this. And so I'm going to calculate it and randomly generate it in this way. And so you're kind of surrendering a little bit of control. So yes, it's faster, but in the long term, it might, like, fixing the mistakes that this has created for you might actually take longer than you doing it old school and just hand drawing it yourself. And again, this isn't necessarily anything like, like Photoshop's a bad program, it doesn't know how to do the thing. This applies to every digital computer program out there, where the more you let the program do the thing for you, the more chances there are that it's going to do something you don't want it to.
Yeah.
So we can try and sort of play around with a bunch of different things. Something else that I can try and do, again, this might be a little bit random, is I'm going to try and tell Photoshop to take a bunch of information in the image and use it to fill other things. And this is what we call content aware. It's in terms of Photoshop's lifespan, it's a relatively new feature. So I've made a selection here on this edge, where there's a bunch of pixel information in here. And this is going to be a complete test where I don't know what's going to happen here. And this is exactly what I was just talking about. So edit, fill, and we can go to down here, content aware. So if you don't want to do that, you can go into edit and then just go straight to content aware fill. And it will do a little bit of a thinking process and kind of basically have a look at a bunch of different things in an image. So I'm just telling it, I kind of don't want any of the pencils, so don't select any of that. Only just get the green stuff. So the green stuff is the stuff that it's going to use to generate an image. And you can see here in the side that it's actually generated paper pretty well for me. And so I'm going to hit OK. And there we go. So again, let's put it on a separate layer. I'm just going to switch it back to normal. So I've basically told Photoshop, like, take all the information from everywhere you see this paper and generate more paper. But it's doing so in a random manner. So in this instance, because it's a pretty simple image, it's done a really good job of that.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to if you've got a whole photograph with a lot more pixel information in there, it might start to do some funny things. So good to kind of remember all these kind of different aspects of Photoshop and sort of building out your image like this. But enough of that. Let's get stuck into actually building out this image and kind of messing around with it a little bit.
Cool. While we're at it, it's slightly off topic, but have you ever gone to the zoo to do like sketches of many animals? Have you ever done that? You have done that?
Yep, I have. These
they move
days,
around, you're like, dude, stay still. I'm trying to draw you.
Yeah. So a little tip for you guys. For you guys is to, when you're doing this, or when you go to, like, you go to a basketball game or to the zoo or whatever, when you're drawing things live, things that are moving around, a little tip for you guys to do, obviously you don't want to be sitting there doing like 10-minute sketches. Your sketches are going to be like 5-second sketches because that's all the time you're going to have. But if you look at a pose of like somebody like slam dunking or something and you want to draw that, if you look and then close your eyes, that image will be like imprinted on your retina for just like half a second longer.
Right.
For you to be able to draw it. Every little bit counts when you're doing this. But again, yeah, I will do these kind of things where I'll go to the zoo or to the museum or whatever. If there's an exhibition on that I really like, I'll go and kind of draw stuff. For better or for worse, these days I'm actually drawing on my iPad more than an actual sketchbook, which is a little bit sad, but at the same time it's cheaper and it's easier, and that's just what I do.
Yeah.
It is. But there is that kind of romantic idea of like taking your sketch pad to the museum and sitting in a corner drawing something. It's kind of nice, but that way I don't have to get pencil shavings and eraser shavings all over the museum floor, and then I don't get booted. All right, so let's start building this out. So I want to play with the colors a little bit with this image. So what I'm going to do is I am going to start putting an adjustment layer on this. So here we go. On my wolf layer, I'm going to go down to here. So this little guy down here, this little kind of circle with a kind of cut in half, is an adjustment layer. And then you get this menu as well, and it's going to just ask you which kind of things you want. Again, just for review, that menu is the same as up here. So these adjustments and image adjustments, they're all here. They're the same ones that are down here. And so we're going to go to Hue Sat, and it's going to pop an adjustment layer on top of my thing. Just in case for later on, I'm going to say I only want you to apply to the wolf water that's underneath this. So I'm just going to click on that. It just means that later on, if I start editing, if I don't have this on and I drop the brightness, you'll see that it's actually doing it to the white of my canvas as well.
You gave me a mini heart attack just then. I thought we lost the feed because everything went black. I was like,
sorry about that.
That's okay.
Done.
Oh, there's another one.
Finished.
Oh my gosh.
So if I just pop that on top, it's going to apply to every single layer underneath.
Yep.
So this button right here just says apply only to the layer immediately below that. So then we've got this happening. So right now it looks pretty terrible because I've dropped the brightness. So this is one of the concessions that you need to make when you're working like this with analog files, is that you're never going to be able to completely separate the white of the paper with the white of the background. Simply because, again, if we zoom in on this, we can see all these different pixels. Like Photoshop is going to have a field day trying to select this without selecting either your image or leaving some white of the paper around it. And so I'd suggest don't even try with watercolor. Maybe other mediums might be a little bit more friendly to this. There are tools that we're not going to go into because they're really, really in-depth, specializing in this kind of stuff. But there are tools in Photoshop that allow you to get a really refined selection that would make this a little bit closer to being perfect. But the reality is, there's too much information here, and telling Photoshop which pixels to select and which to not select is borderline impossible. So don't necessarily try and do that. So it does mean that if, for instance, I want to change the color of my background, I won't be able to do that too much because I will have the white of the paper. Now, you could say, well, why don't you just put the image on multiply? But if I do that, because it's on multiply, it would also change the colors of the wolf itself, because now those are see-through too. And so they are also changing with that. So essentially, if I want to keep the colors of the wolf but lose the paper, I'm kind of between a rock and a hard place, and I can't really do that. Right. So I'm not necessarily going to play around with that too much. I'm just going to change the colors in here. And we're going to change it to like anything in here. Again, this is all non-destructive. So again, don't hesitate to kind of mess around with this, because it will be non-destructive, so you can always change it later on. So I've done that, and I've edited the colors a little bit. And now I've got a mask. Every adjustment layer comes built in with a mask. And so again, we looked at layer masks last week. I'm going to use my gradient tool, and I'm just going to start editing some of this out on my mask.
Cool.
And it's just going to give me this idea of like, oh, there's a nice wash from like green to the actual color now. And I can switch between, X switches between black and white, as you can see down here. So I can bring in some of that color back in. And again, it's going to keep that watercolor look, because I'm using very soft gradients and very soft tones. So it's going to keep that wash quality to it. The beauty of this is later on, I can just come back and go like, you know what, maybe I want to change the color to something else. So like maybe like a pink or red or something. And it's just going to allow me to do that and keep that particular selection going in there. So again, really cool to just get different kind of wash effects on my wolf. And again, still just looks completely watercolory and analog. If you kind of scanned this and printed it, anybody would probably assume that you actually painted this yourself, which you kind of did because you did all the assets, but then you've, like, I guess, enhanced it in Photoshop a little bit.
Yep. Actually, on that, there was a question just in chat. Might be a good time to ask that. When you're working with watercolor brushes, what do you do to avoid a dull gaze in the eyes? Question from RB.
All right, let me, how are we going?
We've got about 6 minutes, so we're almost at Q&A, so I kind of jumped the gun there a little bit as we were talking about watercolor.
So let me just fast forward a little bit here and show you guys, oops, sorry, infinity effects. This is the end result of what's happened here. So this is, as you can see, I've got a few more layers in here. Wow. There's a whole bunch of textures and stuff, but what I've actually done is the eyes were a little bit dull, and so the eyes themselves are actually painted digitally directly in Photoshop. So
that's a solution.
That is not watercolor. It's actually completely digitally done in Photoshop. And so again, trying to get a similar kind of painterly effect, but a little bit tricky to do simply because it's just got it got a little bit kind of dull, and the eyes are super important when you're doing this kind of thing. You'll notice as well on this image that I've got some white pencil, and that is also done directly in Photoshop. So that's just painted straight on top with a white pencil brush, just to kind of enhance that image a little bit and just give it a little bit more kind of pop. So yeah. Again, as long as you can do that in a relatively natural way,
Yeah.
you'll always be pretty sweet to kind of to do this kind of stuff. And so yeah, so you can see here I've got a whole bunch of layers. I've got a whole bunch of different masks on stuff. That's going to start to kind of play around with all of this. So let's add in a bit of an ink splat here. So I want to put in an ink splat here. If I want it to be black, all good. I can literally just go boop, put it on multiply, and it's done. It looks like there's an ink splat on my layer. I might need to kind of play with the levels a little bit just to get rid of all the paper. And then we're good. And that can just sit anywhere on top of my image, and it looks like there's an ink splat on there. Again, if you're doing this analog, and the client suggests, if you're doing this for a client, it says like, oh, put an ink splat on it, and you do this on your actual thing, that's it. Like that lives there now forever. The advantage of doing this in an analog way, if you want to try it out, if you are super keen to do it analog completely, this is all can be also be a good idea to like compile it together in Photoshop and see what it looks like if you put an ink splat. Obviously, you're going to have a really fun time trying to replicate the exact same ink splat on your canvas. But it can. I know a few like painters, like analog artists, who use Photoshop to test colors out to see like, hey, what happens if I add in a cloud here, and like just do it really quickly in Photoshop as a mock-up or change the colors, and then I can paint it again later on. So there are people who aren't necessarily digital artists who will use this. But the advantage of doing this again is that I can resize, I can rotate, I can place it anywhere I want, and it looks completely seamless because it's all done in that digital way. Now, again, there's going to be a bit of an issue here if you're telling me, can I make the ink blue? Probably not, because again, it's on a multiplier layer. So if I go in here and change that color to blue, in fact, let me put it on normal first, and change HueSat, colorize, boost the lightness, boost the opacity, and make it blue. Cool. So that's made my ink blue. But if I pop that back on multiply to get rid of the paper, you'll see like it's as soon as I put it on like a dark background, it's going to virtually disappear. So there is always a little bit of concession. It has worked in a way that looks like transparent ink on different things, but if I wanted that to be completely opaque, like it was paint, that's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for me to be able to like clearly delineate the ink without getting the paper and keep that kind of rough texture, and then be able to put it on a normal layer without any of the paper is going to be very, very tricky. But there are different ways that I can do that. A cool little thing as well that I can try and do here is, let's say that I want white ink on this. Like I want little blobs of white ink. You can see here on my current one that I've got all these blobs of white ink, like there's white paint that's been splattered onto it. That's a cool little thing where basically all I need to do is change that layer to divide, and I don't know exactly what it does, but it makes my paper go away and it makes my ink white. But again, if I start sort of messing around, see if I put that on a darker color, it no longer really works in the same way. So again, there's always that kind of sense of limitations and like concession to what you can or can't do with this kind of stuff.
Cool. Yeah, I like that.
We're gonna just continue kind of messing around with this and just putting in different things. So whoops. Good idea when you've got something that's like this to maybe lock that layer just so that I can keep my selections clean. We're going to make this a little bit bigger. So as I'm doing this, I'm going to lose resolution because this image was scanned in at this size.
As you stretch.
As I stretch it. If I stretch it down, it's fine. But if I stretch it up, it's going to start losing resolution. It's going to get a little bit blurry around the edges. Because I'm using watercolor, it probably doesn't matter too much because it's kind of blurry and fuzzy to begin with. But just something to remember for you guys is, be aware that if you're using these assets, if I zoom in on this, you'll start to see that it's not quite the same sharpness as the rest of my image. So,
and often when you print, you can if you're printing something or you're saving it out as a JPEG, or something, you can see it a lot more as well. Tell you what,
Yep.
Q&A break has really crept up on us
All
today,
right.
but we are
Sweet.
there at a Q&A break. So if you're watching, we'll take a couple of minutes. We'll take some questions. If you're watching on YouTube, jump over to behance.net/live. And that's the chat that we're looking at today. So let us know if you have your questions. I have a couple that I thought of as we were coming through. But what's your go-to adjustment layer? Like, what is the one that you will probably use the
Always hue
most?
sat. Hue saturation.
Yeah.
Hue
I should qualify
saturation
that
is
actually,
where I live.
except for HueSat, because I use that all the time. What's
Probably
like yours?
levels. Probably levels, simply because if I have an image that has different lighting quality throughout, levels is going to allow me to do something that's like, so all right, let's have a look. Actually, let's do this right now. So I'm going to duplicate this guy, hide all of that, and I'm going to purposefully screw with this image so I can kind of see what we're talking about here. I am going to want to burn this. So let's say that I've taken a photograph of this and that I've got like the bottom half of my image is quite significantly darker, or there was a smudge on the page down there, and it's like, you know, a lot darker than the top half of my image, either because the lighting was wrong or anything like that. So again, it's just a rough kind of like faking the screw up on this image. So trying to get that looking right, it's going to be very tricky, because if I go into my levels, and so again, doing this in a kind of a slightly destructive way, to boost my whites to the point where the bottom part here will become white, I'm going to lose so much of my image here. And you'll see what I mean. So if I start boosting that, the top of my image is now fine, but the bottom has basically not changed. So I will have to keep going and going and going until basically my entire image is gone before that happens. So what the adjustment layer allows me to do with this is just put like levels on this. So let's go and put levels. And again, do our little kind of only do it to the layer beneath it. And then I can go and do that, right? To the point where maybe there's a good divide. So these pixels now are separated from the pencil drawing. So I can come later on and just delete that because it's been cut off from the rest of the image. So that's applied. And then I can go onto my layer mask, and with my gradient tool, I can mask out the top section of that image and bring it back in. So that's done it a little bit roughly, but the idea here is that I can apply lighting effect only to a certain portion of the image that will allow me to then control the rest without ruining everything else, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, for sure. Cool.
So that would probably be the most go-to, but yeah, otherwise it's all about the hue saturation for me, and messing around with that.
There's another question Festus was asking around the blob. So the color, we were talking about scaling the blob up and down, and how we lose information, right? So it gets pixelated. Can that be made a smart object? And I know that we're going to touch on smart objects in a bit.
We are going to touch on smart object. It can be made a smart object, but again, smart object. The short answer here is yes, but it won't help in this particular case, because I have where is it? This one. Where is it gone? This one. So the resolution of this image is relatively low. So this has got 1500 pixels at 300 dpi. That's what this has been natively scanned at. And so when I bring it into this image, which is an A4, which is a lot bigger, it's going to lose a little bit of that resolution because I'm going to have to stretch it up to get to it. So the short answer is, if I take this and make it into a smart object only works in a way that preserves the original size. So if you scale it down, traditionally in an image, and that's actually a really good question because it's important to kind of touch upon this. If I've got this image, and let's say that image was at size, right? Like I brought it in and it's that size, I didn't have to stretch it to get it to there. And I want to make it smaller. So I'm going to make this smaller. And then if I apply that transformation, that image is now that size. If I bring it back to its original size, I've lost resolution. So as soon as you apply it to a standard image, it now crunches it down. Smart objects, that's not the case. Whatever resolution you brought it in as a smart object will remain. So if you squash it down, apply it, and then squash it back up, you will not lose any resolution. But you will be limited to whatever the resolution of the smart object was that you brought in the first place, if that makes sense.
Cool.
So I could bring it in as a smart object, but really that wouldn't, in this instance, it wouldn't help me because I didn't scan it at the right resolution to begin with. So again, I would probably just have to go in and scan that at a high DPI setting so that it's a higher resolution. And then I could bring it in as a smart object. There's always a little bit of a balancing act here as well of like, non-destructive is always better, and smart objects are non-destructive. But there also is a thing where you need to consider, like I've seen files from junior designers who've been told this and really taken it on board, but there's just layer upon layer upon layer, and everyone has an effect and an adjustment layer on and everything. It's like, does that now become a little bit too hard to work with because there's just so much micromanagement of all the layers inside groups, inside adjustment layers, inside effects and scale, smart objects and all that kind of stuff, that actually now this is harder to work with than if you'd just done it kind of destructively in a sense. There is a line that gets crossed at some point with like working non-destructively just kind of loops back on itself, and you just like you've made copies of layers and smart objects and all those kind of things. So again, I haven't crossed that line at this stage, and I'm pretty far from it, to be honest. But just be aware that that line does exist, and like everything is a smart object, and everything has an adjustment layer on the smart object and a layer mask and a thing. And it's like, oof, your file's starting to be really heavy, and it's starting to be really difficult to manage that file. So again, there is a line there. That line you will find out just with experience, I think.
Know the line. I like it. Maybe two more questions. What's this? This is like a fairly big departure from what you would normally do. What we'll normally see you on stream and kind of your look and everything. What's another medium that you'd like to explore that's entirely different to your normal process? That's a question from Johanna. Good question.
Great question. I've always been fascinated with oil paints.
Oh yeah?
Yeah. It's the complete opposite of what I do. Smooth, flat colors with smooth, clean lines. Oil paint is just like blend and smudge and merge and texture and everything everywhere. But exactly for that reason, I think it's just because it's like so foreign to me. It's a completely different way of working. I really like the texture. Like I'm classically trained, so I was like, I did my design training with all the like oil painting masters, like very, very like forefront of my education. So I'm always kind of fascinated about how somebody can get a really like a detailed painting, but when you look close up, it's just these giant swabs of like brush strokes that is like, how did they do that? Like, how did they make this like blob that looks like it's been painted with a sponge, but from a distance it's perfect and it makes total sense. It's like ridiculous.
Right.
So yeah, all those kind of things. And I'm not talking about the oil paints that are like super smooth, like the Da Vinci's and the Michelangelos, where it's like really soft gradients. I'm talking about the Monets and the Van Goghs and like Impressionism and that kind of texture. We can see the brush strokes is really like, I find that absolutely fascinating. So I'd love to do that. Unfortunately, for commercial illustration, it's just not like, it's not compatible. If you had to hand in a canvas to your client, and any change that you need to make, you need to redo the entire painting or at least a good section of it. Wait for the paints to dry, especially with oil paints. It takes forever for the paint to dry. It's just not very user-friendly for this kind of stuff, which is why most commercial illustrators, if you're going to work for clients, 99.99999% of the time, you will be handing in a digital file. Even if it's something like what we're doing today, where it's like a bunch of analog assets that come together to hand in,
Right.
it's still going to be a digital file.
Yeah.
And most of the time it will be vector, which is something that I have to like consider when I'm doing this kind of stuff with clients is like, are you okay to get a bitmap file? But yeah, oil paints would definitely be like, if you couldn't do digital, what else would you do? I'd probably try my hand at oil paints.
Oh, cool. I like it. Probably time for one more question from Elizabeth. Great question. Do you find it easy adjusting from traditional to digital media while keeping the same texture?
There's, again, like I said, there's always a little bit of concession. I don't necessarily work that way. Like if you look at my website, it's usually now completely digital. There's all kind of pretense of texture and sort of analog workflow has gone out the window, which I'm fine with these days. It used to be a bit more of an issue for me. But I think, yeah, if you're keen to get that kind of that look and feel of texture in your work, there are ways around it, but to doing it completely digitally, there's a lot of brushes that you can use that have a texture, whether it's in Photoshop or even in Illustrator. Ben Marriott's a really good example of that, where his work looks a little bit more kind of textury and it's got that warmth to it, but it's all done exclusively digitally.
Yeah.
So there are ways to do that. I think at the end of the day, it's one of those things that you just have to kind of find out for yourself, and you learn through mistakes and trying different things. And sometimes, your cat will jump up and hit a key on your keyboard, and it's like, oh, I didn't know that keyboard did that. Like that's happened to me a few times, to be honest. And
That
yeah, I
happened to
think
me yesterday. I discovered that you can automatically send an email in Outlook by pressing something, and I sent a halfway written email to someone. I got no idea how I did it. I mashed the keyboard and magic happened. Not the magic I wanted.
Yeah. So and again, all those things just come from experience and just playing around with the program and seeing what happens when I do this and experimenting with things, kind of like what we're doing today. But as more kind of like the different versions of Photoshop get updated more and more, there's Photoshop 10 years ago was nowhere near as good as kind of blending in the analog and the digital as it is nowadays. There's a lot of stuff that's been added to like help you with that and really kind of make that kind of transition a little bit more seamless. But again, yeah, like I think, like we said at the beginning, if you're going to be working analog and you want to be doing stuff in Photoshop, then consider like what we were talking about before, which is like make your different elements of your artwork separately, and then you can layer them all together easily in Photoshop. And just kind of blend them all together, and that's going to be really like a lot easier to work with.
Yeah, cool, great, I love it. All right, well, let's get into part 2. We got about 45 minutes left. Perfect timing.
Cool.
Actually, there was one more question that might be a quick answer. What do you scan? What DPI do you scan in when you're scanning this in?
All right, so we'll talk about this when we look at saving files, but traditional print DPI is 300. So by default, when you create an image in Photoshop, if it's for print, it will be at 300 pixels per inch, which is what we call like DPI, which is dots per inch. Standard is 300. If you have an image that's quite small, so if you've done a drawing that is like A5, right, so half of A4, and you want to print that on an A4, then you will have to scan it at, I think it's actually not double, it's 144%, I think, which is, it's a weird like geometric maths science. We'll get Neil deGrasse Tyson to talk about this when he comes on.
Yeah,
he's definitely coming on. But yeah, it's not like it's A4, which is technically twice A5. It's like an A4 is 2 pieces of A5 put together. But technically the percentage is 144% increase. It's weird, don't ask, but just for safety, I would just scan it at 600 DPI. If you know that you have an image that is quite small, physically quite small, in the real world quite small, and you want to print it bigger, then you need to scan it at higher than 300. 300 is your 1-to-1 scale. If you want to take a small image and increase its size when it's printed, then you need to scan it at a higher res. And so usually I would scan at 300, except if I've got a really, really small artwork. I've scanned things as high as like 1800 DPI. And it takes a long time, but it just means that you can take that tiny little like 2 centimeter wide drawing and print it on an A0 because you've scanned it at a much higher res without losing any resolution, if that makes sense.
Cool. I like it. Makes sense.
All right, so let's continue with this. So basically, at this stage, the process just kind of keeps going on and on. I've got a layer mask here that I can start kind of blocking it out to get that sort of effect. I'm going to lower the opacity down a little bit. I'm working with a brush that has a bit of a kind of a soft edge that kind of plays around a little bit. This is one of Carl T. Webster's brushes that you'll find right here. So it's Carl's Dry Media Perfect Pencil. Really, any brush that has a bit of a kind of a weird chunky edge or even a kind of a soft edge is going to be fine for doing this kind of stuff. Just what you don't want in here, general rule of thumb, is anything that's going to be hard and clean, which is what I would normally work with, is just not going to be good for you at all. It's just going to give you, you're going to lose all the quality of your line work, and it's just no, just don't even try. So that's just me again, like blocking out, making it as if there was a wash behind that wolf, and then using a layer mask to emulate that. Now I'm going to pop an adjustment layer on that, use that. There we go, and change the color. So we've got a little bit of a kind of wash feeling to it, and fill that with black, and then come in with my gradient tool and just bring some color back into it. So again, relatively seamless. It's not perfect with the watercolor brush details that we've got. For instance, in Fresco, like Fresco's got some really amazing watercolor brushes, probably the best of any program at all. They've like really, really nailed the watercolor look. Which almost makes me sad that I don't work in watercolor very much, because it's just like, man, this is so cool. I really want to do stuff with it, but it's just not like my thing. But yeah, so again, we could like just like spend days and days and days just adding more adjustment layers and different things to this, and just keep sort of building in the detail of all this to get what we're trying to do and to achieve that kind of that look. And again, same thing, we can bring in, so at this stage, I'm just kind of repeating the same process over and over again, where we're just going to grab a texture, bring that in. Quick little thing with transformations as well. So it used to be the case and it is still the case in Illustrator, that when you're trying to transform something and keep it proportionate, right? So it's just kind of like restrained proportions. So this image will only ever be these kind of proportions. In Photoshop back in the days, this is probably about like 6 months old. Any kind of Photoshop specialists out there might correct me on that. It might be a little bit more, but anyways, you used to have to hold down Shift to do this. So Adobe has confused a whole generation of people who grew up holding down Shift to get it proportional and restrain it. And now if you hold down Shift, it actually breaks the proportions. And if you don't, it just does it automatically, which makes a lot more sense, because
it took me a while
generally
for
speaking,
my muscle
you want
memory
to
switch.
Yeah.
What about you?
Same here. Yeah, completely. It's just been like, I still do this every now and then, particularly because in Illustrator, that's still the case. You still need to hold down Shift if you want something to scale proportionally. So it's a little bit kind of strange to have to make that switch back and forth. But another little cool feature that you can do, if you want to scale something really quickly and you want to scale it from the middle, you hold down Option, and it will scale on all sides, not just down from one side. So it just means that it'll start filling out your
I'm all about Option. I don't think I ever do it
Yeah,
without holding down Option.
yeah. It's a really kind of good way to work like this. So I'm just going to hit return, and I'm going to put that on multiply. So we got that kind of cool
Yeah, RB's
texture.
making an important point in chat. You can shift it on in this new version because, of course, people that have been using some people that have been using Photoshop for a while, like, no, I'm not used to it. I don't want it. Like, switch it back to the other. So now you can toggle it on or off. So if you truly hate it and you want to continue holding down
Okay,
Shift, you can change it back now. Because
is it in the preferences?
yeah, I haven't done it. I think I need to
I
progress.
would assume it would be in preferences. Yeah,
Yeah, I assume so. Um, so yeah, you can switch
I
it to
think
your
it's
heart's
like
desire.
it was weird to start with, but I think it's good. Like, get with the times. It makes more sense to have it just be like, you don't need to do anything. We're going to restrain it proportionally. If you don't want it to restrain, then you need to press a key. I think that makes more sense for me, but it
Yep.
was a little bit weird at first, trying to sort of readjust my muscle memory in my brain
Hmm.
to that thing.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, Keith's saying the switch sucks because in Illustrator and InDesign it's still the same. Yes, there's a little bit of
Yeah,
inconsistency amongst you know the
amongst
family
the
of
Adobe
apps.
family.
Yeah, there's a little bit of
Yeah.
infighting around what is, but it's quite interesting. I was chatting to some people in the know about that, and they're just staunchly people in certain camps that use InDesign every day and they don't want it to change, and then there's
Mm.
people that switch between apps that want everything consistent, and I think you can't please everybody at the same time, unfortunately.
No, no, definitely not. Um, so yeah, so again, we're just bringing in different things here and just playing around with different ideas and just kind of going to add a drip here. We don't want it there. We want it right here. There we go. Multiply. Stick that over here. Um, change color. So yeah, so again, it's just at this stage, it's just me just kind of like, hey, what would be cool? I could do this. I could do this. I could add this one. Um, take this guy into here. So again, it's just assembling my image from all these different kind of assets in Photoshop and just messing around with all this kind of stuff to see how it all looks.
Cool.
And then, yeah, eventually we get to here with a little bit more work. But all the layers that you guys will see here is basically just what's been happening with everything that I've done so far. I've just like edited the masks a little bit differently. And yeah, played with different colors and different elements. This is where you can see that maybe naming layers isn't going to be crazy useful. Right, so I've got
Right.
one layer is called ear, red blob, another one's called ear wash because it's the wash that's kind of on the ear. One of them is called background blue wash, left dribble. It's all a little bit just kind of like, the more I do this, the more it's just going to be like, you know, slightly off the ear black dot. Like, it doesn't really matter too much if you don't name your layers at this stage because it's just like naming them's not really going to help you too much in some of these cases. But yeah, that's the kind of the gist of what we're looking at with all of this. And it just, again, that process from in between this and that is just time doing the same steps a bunch of times over and over again,
Hmm.
and adding little bits and pieces. But everything that I've used here is all these assets. So all of this image is literally like that is just built from all of this stuff, nothing more.
That's cool.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about smart objects and how we can use them. So smart objects are basically they're kind of like linked images. They're a little bit smarter than your average object or layer,
Hmm.
and they're going to allow you to do a bunch of different things. And it's a really good way to work, especially if you're working in between Photoshop and Illustrator. That's going to be really handy. It's great if you're working with different assets, and it's really going to save you a lot of time. So let's bring in an image here that we can kind of work with a little bit. So I've got I don't know where I've put it, and I haven't put it anywhere. So give me 1 second here. I should have brought this into my folder here, but no biggie. So I'm going to bring in a vector pattern into my image here, right? So I could either do it in one of two ways. AI file, so this is a vector file.
Right, so it's literally an Illustrator file, right? AI?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
So I could just drag this AI file straight into Photoshop. And when you open an AI file in Photoshop, it'll import as obviously a bitmap, so it'll change it into a JPEG. You can tell it what you want it to do, 300 DPI, grayscale. I don't want it to be grayscale, I want it to be RGB. And that's all good, so it'll import like that. And you'll notice that it's already a transparent image, which is great. It's exactly what I want. So I'm going to take this and drag it into my image here and put it on top. Again, it's not exactly super thematic for what I'm trying to do, but for the example that we're going through today, it'll do perfectly fine. Here's an example of where option on your transform is going to be good. So my image is in the middle, and I don't want to have to replace it and rescale it. So I'm going to grab the side option, drag it in, and it's just going to rescale from the middle and stay nice and centered. So that's going to be a massive help for me.
Don't hold down shift.
And don't hold down shift when you do it. Otherwise, what will happen is this will happen. Just squashes it. No good.
I love the sound effects.
I feel like those sound effects should just be built into Photoshop to let you know that you're making a mistake. All right, so visually I've done exactly the same thing. And so this is where we start to talk about like file building, not just image building. So there is the distinction here is, again, same thing with destructive versus non-destructive. Destructive versus non-destructive from a visual sense, if you were to print the file, makes no difference whatsoever as to what people will see. But the difference is, how does the file work? How easy is it to work with this file for you or for potentially another designer? So if you're working commercially, chances are you're probably not going to be the only person who works with that file. So you're going to have to consider that. If my file here is a mess, which it kind of is at this stage, if I'm handing this over to another designer working in an agency who has to put this on a piece of packaging and they open this up, they're going to look at it for like half a second and go, nope, not interested. I can't make sense of this. I don't know what's what. You need to fix this. And so it's kind of poor form to do this kind of stuff. If you've done stuff destructively and you need to make a change, it's just, you're not making your life a lot easier, and you're not making another designer's life very easy as well. So destructive versus non-destructive visually does nothing, but from a file working perspective, it's everything. So the difference here on a smart object is this. Let's say that I want one of these guys to be blue, right? So I'm going to make a selection of one of these guys. I could do this with an adjustment layer if I wanted to, which again would be slightly less destructive, but the point here is elsewhere, so I'm not going to bother with this just now. I've made my selection, Command U, and I'm going to change that to like a blue. Okay, done. Right. The issue here is, all right, what if I start putting this onto different mockups and different files, and I've got all these different versions of this particular file that I need to work with, and then after I've done all of that, the client decides, actually, I don't want it to be blue. I want it to be back into the same red. So first of all, that's going to be really tricky for me to eyedrop and like go and do the same thing. It's totally doable, but it's just a bit of a pain in the butt to do all of that kind of stuff. So probably not the best way to do this. So where a smart object comes in super handy is this. So I'm going to open this up in Illustrator. So this is the native file for it, right? I'm going to select all of it. So either drag a selection across the whole thing, or Command A, so Command All selects everything. Command C, copy. And switch back to Photoshop and just do Command V. And this little option window is going to crop up saying, do you want to import as a smart object, pixels, path, or shape layer? I want it as a smart object, so I'm going to hit return, and it imports like this. So whenever you see a transform window, so currently I haven't applied the size yet. Whenever you see a cross through it, it indicates that this is a vector smart object. It won't lose resolution as you scale it up or down, which is great. So I'm just going to hit return. Done. And what will happen is you will see that now, I've already had this one in my library, so I'm just going to delete that one. It adds into my image. I've got this little icon down here, which you can see that's a little cloud. And my layer is by default called Vector Smart Object. So in my libraries, which live up here, this little kind of book icon, that's now been added to my cloud, Adobe Cloud library. So what it means is that on any computer that's connected to the internet, if I log in with my Adobe account, this image will then be there for me to place on any work. So if I am working in an agency and I forgot to bring my files, or I didn't know I was going to need that file, and the design changes, and they're like, hey, do you have anything that's kind of like flowery in Japanese? Like, yes, I do. I'm just going to log into my Adobe account and download it, and it's ready to go. So it's really kind of nice to have that available to you. The other thing is, if you have that ready to go and it's not in your image, you can literally just drag and drop it into the image, and it places straight from your libraries window, which is really handy. And then it's still a smart object in your Photoshop. So why is this good? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on the little cloud icon down here, and that will then open up a different version, which is really important to make that distinction, because in InDesign and Illustrator, usually it opens up the original, which means that you're editing your original, which sometimes can be a little bit tricky. So this has opened, that was my original. This is now my Vector Smart Object with a whole link ID to it. So now if I go into here and change the color of one of these things and hit return and save, important to save, otherwise it won't apply the actual change. If I switch back into Photoshop, you'll see that it will auto-update and it switches the thing to blue. And it's updated in my cloud document as well. So this is the nice thing about it. If I have this image here on a bunch of different files, I only have to apply the change once and it'll cascade across to every single file that I've got, which is really like very handy when you're at this stage when you're kind of working around with different things. So that's one aspect of a smart object that you can kind of work with. That's really handy for kind of placing and editing and doing things really quickly. Another aspect of that is if you're doing mockups. So when you're, we'll talk about saving in a little while and all the different file formats that we can kind of work with. But when you're creating your portfolio, when you're creating something for a client, let's say that this is meant to go on a t-shirt, right? So I am actually probably not going to use this example here. I'm going to use a different, I'm going to make a new one. Here we go. And I'm just going to use the one that I created before. There we go. So let's say that I want this design on a t-shirt. Okay. I can close that. What I can do is I can take this and pop it on a t-shirt and it's all good and done. But there are actually a whole heap of Photoshop patterns, sorry about that, that exist for you, and templates that people have made that are PSD templates that will allow you to do that really quickly and that work with smart objects. So for instance, this fan or like any of these things. So I usually go to this website called Graphic Burger and go to mockups and type in what you want to find. So like t-shirt, and it'll bring up, oops, it won't because I typed in the wrong thing.
There's actually a ton also like just natively in Photoshop
Yeah,
like when
there
you
are.
start
Yeah,
a
so
new
there are.
file, you can like switch through.
Yeah, so when you do this, you will find generally down here, there is something like this. So I have got, I don't know if I have a stock thing there. There we go. It's probably actually better if we use one of these, but you can, if you can't find what you want on here, that's a lot of really good ones, but you can find them on there and you can download them when you're kind of looking at creating a new file. So what you'll notice when you look at something like this is if you look at the t-shirt and the jumper, it's got usually these files are built in a way that has either a little mock-up image, in this case it just says your image here, but if you look at the layers, you'll see there's a smart object icon right here. And the layer is usually named your image here, or delete this artwork, or replace this, or any of the kind of things that usually make a bit of sense. They're usually like named in a way that is pretty self-explanatory. So what I want to do is I want to double click on that layer. I don't have that font, but it doesn't really matter because I'm not going to use that artwork anyways. And I'm just going to drag my image on top of that and save. Again, important to save because otherwise it won't apply the change. And then your artwork applies to that t-shirt perfectly. So it's already been masked. You'll notice that that layer has a mask on it. Usually it's got a bunch of effects on it as well. So let me try a different one just so we can kind of see what I'm talking about a little bit better. So this is one that I've downloaded online, and it's just got a little bit of like shading on it and different things. So again, same thing. You can see this layer is called your design here. And so you double click on the little icon and it will open this up. And so I can literally just delete this and place my one in there, hit return. I'm going to rescale it a little bit. There we go. And save. Always super important to save. And then go back to my t-shirt mockup. And you can see that it's actually applied all these kind of shading ripples from the t-shirt kind of folds. And so working like this with smart objects is always going to be really good. Like I can move it around and you see that it just applies seamlessly to that. So this is a really good way to work like this. And then if I go back to this again, like let's say that, you know what, I want this to be a different color altogether. There we go, save, it will auto update in my mockup. Nice. So this is really handy for when you're trying to build out a portfolio or when you're showing stuff to a client of like, this is what the design will look like on a t-shirt. This is what it'll look like on a van or a pizza box or any of those kind of things. It's a really good way to do that. Yeah, or a tote bag or a business card.
Throw it on a tote bag.
And heaps. Yeah. So if we go into here, into our templates, where are they? There we go. In Adobe stock, we'll generally notice that you'll see a whole bunch of different things. Like I said, there's business cards, there's tote bags, there's coffee cups, there's neon signs. There's PPE masks nowadays. It's very, very topical.
Time appropriate.
Some of them are really full on, very, very detailed. Others are a little bit more simple. But again, if you have a Creative Cloud license, all these are free for you to download and add to your thing, and it makes such a difference to how you present your artwork. So definitely use them and get used to using smart objects in that sense. They're not necessarily a big part of the creation of the image, but definitely the output and presentation of the image is really, really handy. Yeah,
I think it's really useful as well to, even in your creative process, it's often like something that we might do at the very end, like, oh, cool, I wonder what it looks like here and here. But actually it can be really useful to do just to actually see, like, what would this actually look like on a shirt? Or what would this actually look like on a business card? Can I read it? Is there enough room for text around it if I need it? And all that sort of thing. Like, it can be a good part even for your own creative process to see what it looks like in the places that you think or know your logo or your design or your illustration is going to end up, just to make sure that it doesn't look a bit funky or doesn't look a little bit weird, or you've designed it in a way that will look good and or be legible, all that sort of stuff. So that can always be useful
Yeah.
too.
And it's I think it's also a really powerful tool for pitching to clients. So like if you're showing a client like here's the artwork, imagine this on a t-shirt. No, like show me the thing, right? It's a little bit like, and here comes another food analogy, but it's a little bit like a waiter. If you brings out your dish and is like, can I have a little bit more salt? And they just go like, imagine it tastes more salty. Well, no, to like show me how the thing looks in real life. So short of actually getting it printed on a t-shirt and bringing in a t-shirt and mailing it to them, which is expensive and at this stage probably not the right thing to do because the design hasn't been approved yet. But showing the difference in between this on a flat JPEG and that showing it to me on a t-shirt that looks like the real thing, it can actually convince a client to use your artwork for something that they hadn't thought of. So, for instance, an example of that is something like this. So let's go a little bit of a shameless plug here from my own website. This is my website. And some of the things that I will do when I'm trying to convince a client to use my artwork is I will totally do these mockups. So here's me kind of doing simple poster mockups. So these are like all over the internet. You can find these very easily. Like, look how awesome this would look nice and big on a billboard. And that can just it can make the difference in between the client seeing just the flat artwork like this, which is like, oh yeah, that's kind of nice, to seeing the end result like this is like, oh my God, that looks so awesome. I want that poster. I want that billboard. Therefore, I need your artwork to have it. But stuff like this as well, like, hey, hint, hint, use my artwork on the actual packaging for the boxes themselves. Like, wouldn't that be awesome for me to have that opportunity to do that? But that's not necessarily going to happen if you just type in the email, like, hey, you could also use this on your packaging, like show them how awesome the thing looks. And that's done with mockups. So it's something that I think a lot of people building portfolios neglect to do. And something that can be really powerful to just reinforce your client's kind of view that your artwork is awesome. And you know what? Like, I ordered t-shirts, but you've mocked up like stickers and food trucks and different things. And like now it makes me want those things. So let's do those, which is great because your artwork gets used more, gets a little bit more exposure. Also, from a material point of view, you get a little bit, you get paid a little bit more. But just nice to have all the different things that happen with mockups that are available to you. So presentation is really something that's super important for you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when we're very lucky to have Christopher Doyle and Co. create a brand for Australian Design Radio podcast that we've been running for a number of years. And in that process, they did a lot of mock-ups. So they did tote bags and they did, all sorts of stuff, more for fun, but also just to also show the brand and the amount. We still get requests for t-shirts because it's on his website, and then people will come over to us and say, hey, like, how do I get one of those cool t-shirts? Like, I really want that t-shirt or tote bag. Just it looks real. Like it's just been done in such a way that it is interesting. So it can be a worthwhile exercise. Yeah. I mean, that was 6 years ago or something. So, and we still get requests every now and then.
Yeah, and again, like it's the power of suggestion, right? Of just like, here, let me see this, and like, yeah, and I'm so completely not surprised that people are just like, where do I get those t-shirts? Because they look like you made t-shirts, and the t-shirts look cool. It's like, I want one.
Yeah,
I want one. So yeah, I think it's really like how you present the work as well as how you do it. We might do a bit of a live stream on that specifically, like portfolio building at some stage, because it is a really big topic. But yeah, just kind of quickly touching upon it here, just talking about smart objects. So we've got about like 20 minutes left. Is that right?
About 15.
15. Cool.
Yeah.
So what I might do is I might jump into outputting your work. So once the artwork has been done, what do you kind of use to output it? How do you save it? All these kind of different things. All right. So let's dive into a little bit of that. So first off is all the different file formats that you can use. There are a bunch of different file formats that you can use. The native one, if I haven't saved this yet, so it's going to come up with a menu. Save, And by default, I've fiddled with this before the stream, so it's not on the default. By default, when you're creating a Photoshop file, the default file format is PSD, which is Photoshop document. That's what we call the native file format. So whenever somebody asks you for the native file, whatever program you're in, they're asking you for the file that that program produces. So if it's Photoshop, it's a PSD. If it's Illustrator, it's an AI. After Effects, it's an AEP, I think. Any of those things, that's what we refer to as the native file. So what this will do is it will save. Let me pop it somewhere that makes sense. Here we go. I'll just leave it untitled for now, but yeah. Here we go. So when you hit save, you will see this window pop up. I might just make this a little bit smaller just so we can see the full menu. There we go. So we've got Photoshop files at the top of the thing. You don't need to know all of these. Different file formats will be specific to different kind of things. To be honest, I have no idea what like 70% of these do. The ones that I use the most, obviously, is Photoshop. GIF, depending on what I'm doing. So if you're doing an animated GIF, that's obviously going to be the file format. JPEG, PNG, and maybe TIFF. Those are the ones that we're going to go through today. All the rest are just like, you probably, unless you're doing something really, really specific, you probably won't ever really need to work with. Those file formats that I've just gone through are the only ones I've ever used on any project at all. So again, don't be too worried about what is PCX, all this kind of stuff. Like, it'll come up when it needs to come up, but they're not the things that you need to remember. So we'll close this and go back into our folder and reopen it. So that's now in here. It's a PSD file. If I double click on it, it will reopen in Photoshop. All of my layer information is there as it is, as it's been created, and it's ready to be edited. So that's your native document. That's always going to be the one that's your go-to working file. If a client asks you for a PSD file, which can happen, less so if you're working in Photoshop, definitely if you're working in Illustrator. Most clients will want, if you're working for print, packaging, all this kind of stuff, even for web, nowadays most people want a vector file, simply because it's scalable, it's easier to use. Their templates and everything else are being done in Illustrator as well. So I used to work a lot with branding and packaging, so like making food packaging or any of those kind of things. The templates that they build to design the packets are in Illustrator, and so they always request an Illustrator file, which is always a little bit kind of like, I wish life wasn't like this, because I usually work in Photoshop. But always ask, like I always ask my clients, are you okay for me to hand you in a Photoshop file? Like, what are you going to use this as? Did you just say that you wanted an AI file out of sheer reflex, because that's the standard nowadays? And so, like, if you're only going to print this on a card, you don't really need it to be an AI. So, always check with your client, and if they say yes, we do need an AI file, then figure it out and make an AI file. Incidentally, watercolor, so stuff like this, whether it's done in Fresco or Photoshop, or like whether it's done digitally or analog, this is the one thing, this is the one contradiction in design. If a client says, I want something that looks like watercolor, but I want it as a vector file, impossible. You've literally just asked for something and it's opposite at the same time. It can't do it, because of the way that a vector file works, which is flat, clean colors and shapes. It technically, for those of you getting ready to comment and be like, it is possible, Jeremy, it is technically possible to do it. But the end result will be so unwieldy to work with, because what will happen is you'll probably have to live trace it. And if you live trace it enough, you see all these little pixels. We won't get into too much detail at this stage, but basically every one of these will be a square shape. And so you'll end up with like jillion different little pixels of different color shapes in Illustrator, and your file is unworkable and weighs a ton. So if a client asks you, I want watercolor and I want it to look like, I want it to be vector, that's just not possible. You can't do that. So don't say yes and then figure out later on, it's like, oops, I don't know how to do this. It's impossible. So Photoshop is that native file format. Your next kind of standard file format for sending an image over to a client to print or a printer to print when they don't need the file to edit. So only ever send over a PSD if you're sending it over to a designer who's then going to go like, hey, you know what, I might want to get rid of this. So can I have that on a separate layer to the rest? So you could just, merge a bunch of layers together and then send over one layer and another layer because that's all they're going to edit. That's perfectly fine for you to do, but always ask, if a client says send over the layers, always just check what they're going to do with it, because it's basically asking for the recipe for the artwork itself. So always just kind of like have a quick question to your client. If they're paying for it, then that's what they get. And you should never refuse it. If they've asked for it, you can always kind of, question that a little bit, but if they're adamant, then you need to give it to them. Otherwise, it's going to be a JPEG. So JPEG is going to be, we're going to do Command S, by the way, is just save. Good one to just remember to do when you're working on the thing. Command Shift S saves as. So this is where you can take your file and save a copy of it as something else. So in this instance, we're going to save it as a JPEG. And we're going to keep it called that. We'll see a little thing here that has an exclamation point next to the layers that says that your layers aren't going to be available because a JPEG is a flat image. We're going to leave image size quality to 12. Baseline standard is totally fine, and hit return. Now in my folder here where I've saved it, this is now a flat JPEG. If I open this up in Photoshop, I just have 0 layers and just the image on its own. All the image sizes and everything have been retained, but it's now a flat image. So I can't change the colors of stuff individually. I can't really manipulate this file too much. But that's a standard image to send off to clients and all that kind of stuff. You will also save a JPEG if you're saving to your website. So if you're posting something on your website, a good thing to do is to go into File, Save As, you will want to, where is the shortcut? I forget where the menu is because I only ever use the shortcut. Again, it's one of those things.
Happens a lot with streams.
This one, Save for Web. Yep. Right? So you can go here, which the command shortcut is Command Option Shift S. So here we go.
That's my jam, because long ago everything we did on the web was all pixels, so everything was all exported, save for web. And so that's that shortcut I've got down. Yep.
And so it'll bring up this menu, and you'll see that this is the original. This is the new image. And if we zoom in a little bit, you might start to see a little bit of quality loss. It'll tell you the size. It'll probably resize it a little bit. You can save it as a JPEG, a PNG, or a GIF. So JPEG is usually going to be your standard go-to for saving images for web or for any of those kind of things, putting it to Instagram, any of that kind of jam. So JPEG is a really good one. But it is what we call a lossy compression. So this gets a little bit kind of techie and a little bit nerdy. Excuse me. Where technically a printer may very well ask you to save as a TIFF. So TIFF is a bit of an argument because the purists will say save it as a TIFF because TIFF is what we call lossless. So the difference is this: every time with a JPEG, because it gets compressed and it's a lossy compression, every time you do something, save the file, it compresses it again. So every time you do that, every time somebody opens and saves it, it compresses a little bit more. So it loses a little bit of quality every time it's opened and saved and closed and reopened again.
It's like those, it's like memes that are shared 1,000 times on the internet, and you see it, and it's
exactly.
Just crushed pixels. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, like you'd have to do that a lot of times. You'd have to open, save, close, reopen like a bunch of times before you'd start to actually notice any loss of resolution to it. So it really isn't that big a deal. If you're just sending a JPEG to a client who's just going to open it and hit print, it's going to be invisible, really. Yeah. Like you're not going to see any loss of compression whatsoever. But with a TIFF, you can either save as a layer TIFF. So TIFF can have layers in it, and it will keep all the layers. So I've got that layers ticked down here. So I'm going to save it as a TIFF. And this comes up. So I can say no compression. I can say JPEG compression, but then it defeats the purpose of a TIFF because it's going to start compressing the data every time it does it. So kind of defeats the purpose. So we're going to leave this exactly as it is and hit OK. Including layers will increase file size. Yep, all good. And so weirdly, if you look at my TIFF and you look at the size of my image, 117 megs, and the size of my, they're exactly the same. Yeah, a little bit bigger. Usually the TIFF is a little bit bigger. I don't know why it's doing that today, but the layered TIFF will be bigger than the layered Photoshop file, which is strange. It kind of like expands the size of the image.
Yeah.
That's with the layers. So I'm going to delete that one. And I'm going to show you guys what happens if you save it without layers. So this is now going to save it as a flat TIFF.
Just letting you know, we've got about 2 minutes left.
Okay, cool. So now my flat JPEG is 7. My flat TIFF is 26. So it's quite a sizable difference for no visual difference and no file working advantage. So generally, like TIFFs aren't necessarily the bee's knees as everybody thinks. And then the last one that I want to go through very quickly is a PNG. A PNG is a transparent file that allows you to just save something as a layer. So for instance, if I've got something like this PNG file right here, I've got that as a separate layer. If I save this as a PSD or as a JPEG, if I save this as a JPEG, that little square, white and black square will show up just like it does with this one. So that's part of the image. The difference is a PNG is transparent. So when I preview it, even though there's more image around it here, it's just see-through. The advantage is when I bring this into an actual file, or if I save this to the internet, there will be no border around it in here. So I can actually just kind of save it to whatever I want. And usually they're indexed, so it gets a little bit clunky. And my Photoshop is done. Anyways, so whenever you're saving a logo that's like a circle and it fits inside of a square online, you have to save it as a PNG. Your icons will need to be saved as PNGs. So those things, JPEG, Photoshop, PSD, TIFF, and PNG are the main ones that you'll want to work with.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad we had the time to kind of do a bonus little bit of file, understanding files and formats and exporting and
bonus
stuff like
round.
That. Bonus round is always cool. So thanks for taking us through that. And thank you, Chad, for hanging out with us. We are out of time today. We're back tomorrow with Greta Larkins, which will be for the first time coming on Adobe Live, which is very exciting. We're creating some GIFs and things like that. So 9 o'clock tomorrow here. Festus R&B. Johanna, thanks for hanging out with us in chat. And thank you everybody out there in YouTube Land and Behance. And we'll be back next week at the same time with Jeremy Lord for our final beginning in illustration series. So thank you so much, Jeremy.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Thanks for the questions, and we'll see you guys next week.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.